Business Roundtable is 200 CEOs of some of the country's biggest companies. You mentioned 5 of them at the outset who are participating in our Innovation Summit this afternoon. And I'd say overall for those CEOs, they remain upbeat. They're still planning more investment, more hiring. They're looking for good growth in the economy. So they're seeing a world that's pretty turbulent, but they're still able to do pretty good business, especially in the United States. And one of the things that's obviously causing the turbulence right now is trade policy, trade tension. And our CEOs have been warning about that for 2 years. So they're not in surprise mode. They're certainly not surprised by what the Fed is up to right now. They've been expecting that for a long time. So I wouldn't consider our business leaders to be back on their heels or surprised, but they're concerned about the turbulence in the international environment, especially on trade.
Josh, you were chief of staff. I mean, everybody in the administration had to know what was happening in Vancouver during the whole meeting over the weekend, the G20. That would have been orchestrated by people that were also involved in the trade talks, right? I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, Joe, I was chief of staff during episodes like that, and the truth is, no, not everybody in the White House knows that kind of thing. There's a pretty strong membrane that operates between the law enforcement elements of our government and the political elements of our government. And in the White House that I was in, which was Bush 43's White House, the counsel to the president probably would have been alerted about a law enforcement matter, but probably would have been pretty careful about spreading that word to anybody else.
Josh,
so I wouldn't read too much into the timing.
Well, help us then read, but then read what you like into it. I'm just trying to understand. You're seeing this headline across the tape this morning, and you're thinking what? You're thinking that when everybody was in Argentina together, they knew this, they didn't know this, and what are the larger implications in your mind?
Well, I'm thinking, yeah, maybe some of the people sitting around that table knew it, but they also knew that it's a law enforcement matter, and the political elements of our government should not be interfering in law enforcement matters. So that was a thought I had, but to step back and...
Well, Josh, 1 second on that, because I don't quite follow. So if the U.S. is saying, you know, we're going after Huawei because it violated, you know, our sanctions on Iran, you don't think that had any political aspect to it? That if nothing else, was initiated for fundamentally political reasons?
Oh, no. There's definitely political level decision making involved in how vigorously we're going to enforce our Iran sanctions policy. But it is the law of the land. And once you ask the Justice Department to enforce a policy, you got to let them do their job, and then you step back and you don't from the White House anyway. You don't micromanage something like an arrest of one individual. But stepping back for a second.
The ZTE story, by the way, turned into its own chess piece in the trade game, if you will, in a way that traditionally, perhaps when you were in the White House, it may not have been. Yeah,
that. I'm not sure every administration would have handled that one exactly the same way, but Joe, to step back to the bigger story here, yeah, there's a lot of tension between the U.S. and China. It's been building for a long time. Most of our CEOs, you know, stepping back from the turbulence of the last few days, most of our CEOs were encouraged by the results in Buenos Aires, because it means that the U.S. and China are finally sitting down to have a serious negotiation about some very difficult problems involving reforms of the Chinese system that are really complicated. And most of our folks are glad to see that getting underway, because even while a lot of our folks don't support some of the tactics the administration has been using, they support the objectives. It's time for reform in a lot of Chinese international trade practices.
That brings us into what the Roundtable is focused on, and that's an innovation summit. And we know how important innovation is across the board for everything that we try to accomplish, and it's sort of the heartbeat of why the United States has been so successful. But we don't like our innovation to be either where we're mandated to share it with someone or it's actually stolen from us. So I can imagine that while these guys don't like tariffs, they're probably glad that finally, we're looking this issue straight in the face and trying to protect things that we develop here that can help our country. And we don't want to take a back seat by 2030 and be the second or third leading country in the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Most of our companies have faced some sort of challenge with their intellectual property in China. In some cases, it's outright theft, which the Chinese have indicated a willingness to crack down on. In other cases, it's forced technology transfers that are supported by the way China runs its economy, and that's the kind of thing that needs to be negotiated. There's a lot more to the innovation agenda beyond that, but that's a key element of it, and it's one of the items that we're going to be discussing at this conference this afternoon.
Josh, with Huawei, this going on right now, how much do you think that is literally, the gloves have been taken off? What kind of climate do you think it's going to put around the negotiations that will take place in the next 90 days? And how much of this, just the communication of what went on in Buenos Aires, is that creating more uncertainty?
Let me take the second question first. Yeah, normally a communique would have been negotiated, and you'd be working on the fine points of an agreed readout of what happened at the meeting 2 weeks before the meeting. But President Trump is much more improvisational, and so you get more confusion after a meeting if the meeting is actually more of a meeting. But that's the way President Trump operates. Generally, on issues like Huawei, on all of the issues we have with China that don't necessarily touch on international trade, yeah, we are in a very turbulent period. But it is where we are with China, and it's been building up for a long time. And hopefully, the two governments will use the next 90 days to resolve as much of that as possible, and get some results in the 90 days, and then agree to keep talking on the other things. That's the right way to handle this. And the Huawei situation ought to be on the table as well.
Yep.
But I think the Chinese government and everybody needs to understand that those are the laws of the United States, and everybody certainly in our portion of the business community says enforce the laws and operate from there.
We're running out of time, Josh. I'm trying to. There's so many issues we'd like to get to, but business investment. People see that as kind of a disappointing aspect of what we were hoping for from tax reform and deregulation. Is it disappointing? Is there still uncertainty that a lot of the CEOs that you're with down there that they're feeling from all these other issues, or are we expecting too much too soon from the change in the law?
Well, boy, unanimously, our CEOs think of the tax reform and the regulatory reform that's ongoing as an unmixed positive. And we have seen investment go up about 7% year on year. And that's long-term investment. It's not, sometimes the tax reform gets described as a sugar high. That's not it. It's a fundamental change in the way we do taxation in this country. It makes the United States competitive. And I think it's going to be promoting investment for many years to come. So from the standpoint of tax policy, regulatory policy, all good from the standpoint of our businesses. Now there are, partially offsetting that tailwind, there are some pretty strong headwinds, and the biggest one is, in fact, trade policy. And that's what we're going to be talking about for months to come, certainly.
Yep.
But there's a lot of other stuff on the agenda, too. Workforce policy, immigration policy, data privacy, all of those things need to be part of the agenda. And in my view, there's some good reason for optimism looking out
Yeah.
over the next year.
Well, if you live long enough, Josh, you see anything, and
I've lived long enough.
you have lived long enough to see both 41 and 43 embraced by the mainstream media. So you live long enough, you'll see anything. Well,
Yeah, there's a silver lining, Joe. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you, Josh Bolten.